we're at the hour. Leah, how are we going in terms of members dialing in?
We're about 3 people short, but you can go ahead.
Right. Yeah, I think I will start off now. So welcome everybody. As Dave said, the last CAG meeting of the year. Quite an extraordinary year, I guess, for everybody, and I think we talked about it. So I'm happy to see all of you in good health, and I hope you will kind of manage to do so until this pandemic comes to an end. We have 2 apologies for today, which is Sammy and Jeanette Makolo, and I received 2 partial apologies from Rosa and from Inge. Both can only attend parts of the meeting, if any. Rosa has to go to a very important meeting of the European Commission. She's probably with us already, but she has to leave, and Inge has to travel to Berlin as a member of the German Bundestag, and probably she will dial in, but not for the whole board CAG meeting. Sorry. So with that, anything else, Dave, in terms of admin?
Nothing on my end, Thomas.
Perfect. Okay, with that, we can come to the approval of the minutes of the last meeting, which is the June meeting minutes. We didn't hear anything so far, Dave, right? And we got written comments from Rosa, and she wasn't indicating anything as well.
We had some minor edits from members that we've already passed along to members.
Right, perfect. So thank you for that. Anything else, CAG members, which you want to raise at the moment? Okay, that doesn't seem to be the case. So with that, the minutes are approved with the minor edits and amendments Dave just mentioned. Thank you for that. And then we can jump right into the agenda. We have 3 agenda items on the agenda for today. First, as always, the program and technical director's report on work plan. I think very interesting in connection with the agenda topic 3, which is the mid-period work program consultation. And Dave will introduce us to the high-level review of responses, given that the consultation period just ended November 30. So obviously there was not a lot of time, but he put together a presentation summarizing what the main kind of areas of feedback were. And then the third agenda topic is on the measurement suite of projects ED 76 to 79. You have seen the agenda paper regarding that, and we will focus on the discussion on current operational value and the kind of some guidance and advice regarding the review of responses for Dave to have some insights in what CAG members view to be important when he's analyzing the responses to the consultation. All right, with that, Ross, I hand it over to you to start with the technical director's report.
Thank you, Thomas. And I'm just going to share my screen for a couple of quick slides here. Just bear with me. Hopefully everybody can see my screen.
Looks good, Ross.
Thanks, Dave. So this is just the title screen. You can see a nice shot of Toronto where we would normally be meeting at this time of year. It's not normally that sunny and warm looking, but we're starting to get to the cold weather now. I'll take the report today as read, and those of you who joined the September update for the CAG put on by Dave will recall maybe some of the points I'll touch on now, but there are a few things I did want to highlight just for CAG members' information before we get into the substantive discussions today. I'll also update on a couple of other non-direct project related activities, just for, again, for information and so CAG members are aware of some of the other developments. The first one I wanted to highlight today is related to ED 75 leases. The board is looking to approve IPSAS 43, which is based on IFRS 16, based on the strong response we received to ED 75 from constituents. And I did want to highlight that a lot of the direction we decided on ED 75 was influenced by earlier CAG discussions, where a couple of CAG members in particular strongly encouraged the IPSASB to kind of have a look back after ED 64 at the ISB's experience in developing IFRS 16 and to consider whether landing that lease accounting model might be a good way forward before moving to the other lease type arrangements. And that's exactly what the board did do when it developed ED 75. Again, there were no substantive comments flagged that required further consideration by the board. That's why we're not having a full item on leases today. But I did want to flag that the other lease type arrangements stream of the project, which deals with the public sector specific issues and mainly concessionary leases, along with other topics, will continue in 2022. And it's highly likely that we'll have a session with the CAG in either June or December 2022 to discuss the project as it progresses. But the key for the board strategically is to land the leases model in IPSAS 43. And then with that as the frame, consider the issues from the request for information as it determines how it wants to deal with each of those issues in the feedback received. Moving on to revenue and transfer expenses. Again, this is an item that's been heavily discussed with the CAG over the past couple years. And very happy to say that a lot of the good advice received from the CAG has really helped to shape the board's way forward on this. Along with the responses we received to ED 70 to 72. But the key things to update on both these recent developments from the board perspective is that on revenue, the board has decided at its October check-in that it would take the two pieces of revenue guidance and combine them into one revenue standard. And this is, again, an idea that surfaced in discussions with the CAG previously and was also highlighted in the comment letters. And on transfer expenses, again, through previous discussions with both the CAG and in the comment letters, there was a push to really reconsider the perspective of the transaction from a transfer provider's perspective, rather than being too reliant on the revenue recipient perspective. That, along with consideration of ensuring the model was a little bit more practical and simple, as the ED 72 model was criticized as being a little bit impractical to apply. So the board has decided to move away from that model and adopt what I call a rights-based model to recognize an asset. And the board will be having a discussion on this coming this week. So there's still more to come on developments in this space, but the board is exploring those items. Natural resources, again, a lot of great input from the CAG over the last couple of years has really helped shape both the scope of that project as well as the approach on some of the issues. The board's been having really interesting and important debates on this topic and making a lot of progress on the CP, but the initial timelines that saw us approving a consultation paper in 2021 have slipped slightly, and we're now targeting a March 2022 approval of the CP. And depending on the discussions this week, that's starting to feel like a realistic goal, and that we will have something out in early 2022 and be able to start to talk to our constituents about this important project. Retirement benefit plans is the other project I wanted to highlight today and just provide a bit of an update on. And I should note that we've received thoughts from the CAG on this project, including the CAG reviewed the project brief in April 2022, and we received a couple of sets of really helpful comments from CAG members that did impact and change that project brief around the scope. And really the idea the board took to not just take IS 26 and align with it as we normally would with an ISB standard, but to take a more practical approach and adapt it. And we're adapting that standard by looking to national standard setters who've already brought in the IS 26 guidance in their jurisdiction and looked at areas where they've adapted it and removed some of the optionality in IS 26 that many people had flagged they thought would be problematic in the public sector. That's been going quite well, and we're looking to approve that exposure draft on Wednesday. And should we approve it on Wednesday, we'll hopefully get it out for comment very early in 2022. I've also got the mid-period work program and measurement on here, but I'm not going to get into those discussions today, simply to save time for agenda item 3 and 4 when Dave is going to go through these in detail. But before I pass it on for any CAG comments, I did want to highlight a couple other quick updates, and I won't spend a ton of time on here. It's more just information sharing. But I did want to just flag to the CAG members that sustainability is a very important topic at the moment. Internationally, both private and public sector. I don't think that's news to anybody. I think everyone who's following the space has seen the announcement at the beginning of November of the stand-up of the private sector board, the International Sustainability Standards Board. We've been monitoring that quite closely. Ian's a member of the Technical Readiness Working Group, I think is the name, and has been involved and followed the discussions in the stand-up of the IPSASB, as well as the prototype guidance that they issued. And if you're interested in those developments, there's some links in my paper where you can read more about it. And if you wanted to have a chat with staff offline, we're happy to connect and share any information we have. But the key to frame here is the board itself has been having discussions in private sessions as it starts to figure out strategically what it might do in this space, knowing that it's likely we'll have to do something. Hopefully in 2022, those discussions will start to become more public as we go through our process of finalizing the approach. And I would say definitely in 2022, you can expect from CAG members' perspective that we'll start to discuss issues related to that stream of work with CAG members themselves to get input. So not much more to say on that topic now other than watch this space. But I did want to flag a couple of important developments related to adoption implementation materials for a couple reasons. One, so CAG members are aware, but also if you're dealing with anyone adopting and implementing, there is a growing suite of helpful implementation material freely available on the IFAC and IPSASB website. So firstly, I just wanted to highlight that we've been working throughout 2020 and 2022 to prepare and get ready for the International Sustainability Standards Update process. And this is where that should say International Statistical Standards Update process. That's a typo. Apologies for the error on the slide. But this is really where the statistical community is starting to update its guidance. And we've been very active in feeding in developments related to topics on an accounting perspective so that the statistical community is aware of the developments on accrual accounting with the aim of hoping to make the accrual accounting data more useful for statistical standards. That process is still ongoing and will continue for a number of years, but we thought it strategically important to make sure that we're sharing our conceptual developments around accounting, and so that the statistical community can take the opportunity to align with our guidance to the extent practical for their perspective, kind of mirroring our own process where we follow statistical guidance in our development process and try and align where we can. So that's ongoing at the moment and an interesting space. In 2022, we'll be putting out a statistical alignment dashboard that builds off our current tracking table so that people can see quarter to quarter developments and alignment with statistical standards. In June 2021, we put out the International Public Sector Accountability Index, and this takes data points from 2020, 2025, and 2030, and highlights the progress towards accrual adoption for 165 of the surveyed countries in our study. And it confirms the trend from 2018 that there is significant movement towards accrual and continuing momentum over time to see quite a shift in the next 5 to 10 years in the use of accrual in the public sector. Again, this is available on both the IFAC and IPSASB websites, and this piece of work was also supported by CIPFA, so I should note that. Probably the most current or recent update that I wanted to flag is what's called EIS. And this is a digital platform for all of the standards developed through the IFAC network. So the audit standards, the ethics standards, and of course the IPSAS standards. And this is it'll progress over time and improve. So this is the first version of that where they've digitized the standards. It allows a more comprehensive, proper search of the standards. It also has a digital table of content that makes the navigation of the standards more simple. And it also includes hyperlinks that help you be able to kind of cross-reference things with a click, which again is quite helpful. Now, IFAC's continuing to develop this tool over time, and we'll add more functionality in future versions. But if you're using the IPSAS, or you have clients or constituents using the IPSAS, please make sure to flag this tool. It's free to use. All you have to do is register to use it, and you can access the standards in this way. Again, there's also an ability to give feedback as well. So if you find any glitches or anything that you think is not working right, you can flag it within the tool itself, and the team that's developed that will receive that and help troubleshoot it, and so that future versions have less kind of bugs in them. Did want to touch quickly on the Train the Trainer materials that were put out by IFAC in 2020. And this is a comprehensive suite of slides supported by a course pack for the whole suite of IPSAS. And this has been well received in a number of jurisdictions, and is an important development for those jurisdictions looking to build up their knowledge of IPSAS. And just to note that IFAC's looking into translation into Spanish and French at the moment. No decision on timing or how quickly that'll happen, but it's on the radar, and highly likely that those materials will also be in a couple other languages in the near future. And in early 2022, we'll be publishing updated Study 14, which is now called Pathways to Accrual. And again, this will be a web-based interactive platform that will take the current PDF of Study 14, modernize it, and make it more accessible and usable. And that's expected out in early 2022. And then from an outreach perspective, I'm not going to get into too much details here, but I did want to highlight two particular important pieces of outreach. So we held roundtables in areas of IPSAS adoption, implementation, growth. So Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And in particular, I wanted to highlight that for the first time ever, we had a roundtable in French for Francophone Africa. And just thanks to our French-speaking members, Hervé Adrienne Metzger and René Pichard, who helped us carry out those events by using their native French language abilities to help present in French to a French-speaking audience. So that was well received, and a good endeavor into that region to help us continue to build ties in an area where we know there's accrual accounting implementation ongoing. And just to note that we've got a call for papers, and we're progressing with a number of research proposals on topics that were put out earlier in 2021. We've just selected 5 papers from the abstracts we received, and that will be given small grants to fund the development of papers. And in 2022, those papers will progress with a research forum together with co-host Cigar in September 2022. And then some of those papers will be presented to the IPSASB board so they can see the research. And just to highlight that this is an ongoing activity, I think this is the 3rd call for papers we've now undertaken with the academic community, and it's been quite positive way to get academic input at the front end of important projects and initiatives. And with that, Thomas, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Happy to take any comments from members on any parts of today's discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Ross. I think that was really interesting. I think the slide on the work program update really showed how valuable the input of the CAG and of the CAG members is and was, especially in kind of regard of the projects you mentioned regarding revenue and transfer expenses. I think there is a clear trace of the comments of CAG members and the CAG discussion. So I think that it's really great. Thank you for the second slides and the more overarching issues. I think we will hear from Ian in the context of that mid-period work program agenda item 3, a little bit more background to sustainability. So I will not go into that into more detail at the moment. Regarding adoption and implementation, Ross, I think I can only congratulate the staff for the great work you have done in that regard. probably adding SIPFA when it comes to the Public Sector Accountability Index. I think the material which you developed here is of immense help for the implementation out there. I know that from my practical experience. So the digital IPSAS and the upcoming study 14 or pathway to accruals will be really, really helpful. And I already saw the EIS. I can only encourage everybody to have a look. It's amazing. It's really amazing. It makes the work with the standards so much easier. So that's really amazing. So thank you for the great work here. And last word from my side regarding the statistics, I think that this is really definitely a unique chance at the moment for kind of work on closing gaps. And definitely having this statistical alignment dashboard will help further. We see these discussions happening all the time in the context of the IPSAS project, especially. And therefore, I think that that's really a huge opportunity to bring kind of minds closer together, if not the accounting, but to kind of increase the mutual understanding. I think that
I think we might have lost Thomas for a second here. I think he was just about to wrap up. So there was one comment I wanted to make following his comments, and that was just to note that the adoption implementation materials that have been developed are actually an initiative that's occurring directly under IFAC. So IPSAS staff are supporting and involved in that, but there are IFAC staff and their IFAC publications that are supporting the broad adoption of standards, and that kind of cuts across all the standard setting boards. So I should make sure to give them credit for that. But with that, maybe until Thomas comes back, I'll keep things moving by going through the hands that are up. And I think Fabienne was first. So maybe over to you, Fabienne.
Yes, thank you, Ross. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I just wanted to support Thomas's thanks to IFAC and the various initiatives to facilitate access to IPSASs and to provide information about IPSAS adoption, and on the EIS digital platform, which I tried and tested, and which is quite good and quite helpful, and also on the index on global IPSAS adoption, which provides quite useful information and very useful tools. So thank you very much. In addition, I find also the sustainability reporting and academic advisory group web pages very informative. So thank you for that also. And I think it's more the staff than the IFAC that time. And then with respect to the work plan, I also wanted to underline the excellent work of the IPSASB and the staff on the measurement and revenue and transfer expenses packages. I think there's been a lot of efforts put into those projects alongside other very heavy projects such as natural resources, leases, retirement benefit plans, and the concept of framework update. And all these major projects are tied to public sector specificities and identify those specificities and address them. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabienne, for the comments and for the nice words on the progress on projects for staff. I can tell you it's been a busy year for staff, and everyone's really put a lot of work in to get where we are today. And I think the quality of the papers for both the CAG and the board are of high quality, and it's nice to receive the positive feedback. We're always open for the criticism, but it's nice to hear something nice too. So thank you, Fabienne. Catherine?
Thank you very much. I mean, I echo the thanks and praise for all the work that's been carried out. Some really good progress. I've got three brief comments. One is just on the revenue standards. I mean, it is great to see the progress that's been made. I think the thing that we talked about last time about the usability and readability and clarity of the standards is going to be, key. So it's all going to be about practically, can people understand them when they're out or it's out. And the sort of how you might go about testing that, because it's such an important standard to make sure that everybody really understands what it's asking for. My second comment is about sustainability. It's not a criticism. I don't quite know why all of the debates have been carried out in private so far, but this is a debate that's happening in the public sector in the UK as well, in terms of what the public sector role is and what we might do about sustainability standards. I would just urge you to hopefully get to a position where you can make some more public statements about it, because I just feel that it's lacking at the moment, that we haven't got anything stated publicly when there's a great sense of urgency everywhere else. I mean, while we're debating how the IPSASB standards might be adopted in the private sector in the UK, the public sector has got such a massive role to play around sustainability issues that I do worry that the public sector is falling behind. And we're certainly pushing very hard for the UK government to catch up with that. So I just would urge you to get some messages out as early as you possibly can around that, in terms of what you might be doing around it. And I can't remember what the third thing was. Oh no, I know what it was. When we get to the measurement debate, I think this point about the national accounts and statistical side of things, it might come to the fore again, that we talk about that, because I do think that some of the where we've got to a measurement in certain countries has been influenced very heavily by what national accounts require around that. So I do think that as well as what's happening on the statistical side of things, how that meshes with or deviates from the IPSASB standards, I think is going to be an important issue, and we should talk about that perhaps again on the measurement debate when we get there. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Maybe I'll try and address your first point on why we've been in kind of having some discussions in private on that. And I don't know, Ian, if you want to come in maybe after my point to kind of clarify, but I wonder,
Ross, whether we could sort of hold discussion on sustainability and bring it together in the next item, because I think the work programme discussions are obviously in that context. So I'm happy to address it, but I think if we can just pick it up, I'll address it under the next item when Dave's given the overview on the responses, if that's okay.
So I'm back. Sorry. What can you do?
Yeah.
I probably missed some very, very smart and clever comments, but I'm sure I will see them in the minutes then. So Karen, I think you raised your hand.
I did. Thank you very much. And I too wanted to kind of echo that both the presentation that you gave, Ross, and what's in the papers, it really feels like there is good progress there, and that comes across loud and clear. I too wanted to mention sustainability, but I'll hold off on that until we get to the next agenda item. I think the point that I wanted to make here really was about, I think, as you said, Ross, in your presentation, some of where the IPSASB has got to in its deliberations have been because of the input that has come through the CAG. And I wonder if now that we've been running for a while, there's kind of some lessons learned in terms of what was most effective in terms of what the CAG did, and whether there's anything that we can do to kind of improve the inputs that we make as a group in terms of what's really helped the groups. It's great to hear that it is positive, but some of these things still feel like it's been quite a long time from the CAG input to where the board have got to, and that may be that that's just the natural cycle of things, or it may be that we could have done something different, or Secretariat could have done something different, and I wonder whether there's an opportunity to learn any lessons from that.
Thanks, Karen. Ross, do you want to respond immediately?
Yeah, just maybe to note that we can maybe at the next CAG meeting bring back a bit of a kind of a look back on that with some thought. Just take it away. I know from discussions we've had within staff and with Ian and Thomas, we've found things as over time have evolved in ways to pick better topics and have discussions at better timing and things like that. But it's probably better if we pull together our thoughts in a short paper to kind of share those in a way that allows a bit of a discussion with the CAG, if that works for everyone.
Okay, thanks, Ross. I think in that context, Karen, I think it's always good to kind of hold on for a moment, to do some stock taking. Everything is good, but could it be even better? I think what we always kind of discuss when we kind of prepare the CAG papers is that it is absolutely essential that the questions are asked in the right way, because the questions are framing the discussion, and the questions really should point to what is kind of in the need of the board. So I think it's an improvement process as well. I agree with you in that. But having kind of a stock taking, I think, Ross, would be good. Perhaps we could add this stock taking exercise by having kind of 2 or 3 CAG members involved as well to get their impression, and then we can kind of do kind of 360 degrees perspective on that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that would be good from the staff perspective. If there's 2 or 3 CAG members who have a particular interest in this and would like to be involved, I think I would ask if Karen might volunteer. It's her initiative. I'm sure.
I think she is a natural candidate. I was going to say that already. So Karen, it's always dangerous to put up your hand, but I think you're not afraid of that.
No, that's fine. I'm very happy to do that.
Looking forward to your contribution. Great. All right. If anybody else would be interested, just kind of approach Ross. I think that would be the best. And then if we end up having 26 volunteers, I think you see that obviously there is a big need, but I wouldn't expect that. Any other comments? Right. If that is not the case, just one question I was going to ask when somebody cut off my line. Probably it was you, Ross, not to being asked the question.
Ross, you did it again.
I think I did it again, yeah. Uh-oh.
So Ross, I think we're wrapping up anyway, so I can just move into the mid-period work program consultation if that works.
Yeah, I think we'll have to do that just in the essence of time, and maybe when Thomas comes back or at the end, we can pick up on his comment.
Okay. So I will move into the mid-period work program consultation, and it was encouraging to already hear some comments on sustainability, because I guess giving away the entire presentation, that's kind of where we'll end up. So it's good that you're already thinking about that, because the IPSASB is going to want to hear your comments. But I thought I'd give a brief, I guess, background and presentation just to remind CAG members where we are and how we got here, because I know it's probably been 6 months or so, or more than 6 months since you've seen it. So I thought a reminder was in order to just help the discussion. So I'm just going to share my slides. And to kick things off, it's really important to put this entire mid-period work program consultation into context. And what I mean by that is, when developing the mid-period work program consultation, this document was developed in the lens or within the context of the current 2019 through 2023 strategy. And this is important because when the strategy was developed, the IPSASB at the time had the foresight to see that a mid-period work program consultation was important and was necessary. And they really did this because they thought, I guess for 2 main reasons. One, they foresaw the IPSASB working in a different environment. And then 2, as you would have seen in Ross's work program update, resources are starting to become more available as we move through the midpoint of this strategy and we start to wrap up projects. And you can kind of see in 2022, 2023 is when we expect to wrap up some big projects, and IPSASB, not only board time, but staff time becomes more available to take on more projects in the work program. The other important point to this consultation taking place within the context of the strategy is this consultation isn't proposing any changes to the strategy itself. It's only looking to add new projects to the work program. And one important point, and this will really come through at the end, is in developing this mid-period work program consultation, the IPSASB spent a lot of time talking about one stream of projects and whether it wanted to add a project on sustainability. And what the IPSASB concluded at the time, and this was 6 months ago, was the IPSASB didn't want to propose or prioritize adding a sustainability project. It didn't feel it was the right time. It thought it was too much of a change within the current strategy. But that didn't mean the IPSASB wasn't going to do anything. As Ross mentioned, I won't retread this too much, but it is, Ian is actively taking part in supporting the foundation of the International Sustainability Standards Board. We are looking to offer our public sector expertise where it applies, and we're really staying involved in influencing that regard. Now, again, as we get to the end of this, it'll be interesting to see how all the comments come back and feed to this, but that was the design of the consultation when it was written. We really tried to exclude sustainability from the comments we received back, or the responses we received back from constituents, because 6 months ago, the IPSASB just didn't think it was the right time to really shake up the strategy. So what was proposed were 6 projects, and these were broken down into 2 categories. We proposed 2 major projects, financial statement, presentation of financial statements, and differential reporting. And presentation of financial statements is a really important project because this is really, from a user perspective, the first interaction that users have with that financial information. So if they want to learn financial information or see an entity from a financial perspective, picking up a set of financial statements is really their first interaction with that. So the IPSASB thought it was important to prioritize this, and any ways that the IPSASB can facilitate that interaction, make that interaction easier for users, the IPSASB thought it was a high priority project and something that should be prioritized. The second major project that was put forward was differential reporting. Again, this is an extremely important initiative because, and as Ross touched on this, with the accountability index that was released back in the summer, it shows this trend of more and more public sector entities around the world adopting accrual accounting and in many cases, some form of IPSAS. One of the challenges we hear often is, even though IPSAS is a robust set of guidance, it can be challenging to apply for those entities with fewer accounting resources to really dig into many of the complexities that IPSAS provide, because there's such a robust set of standards. So what differential reporting would offer is a different accounting framework for those less complex entities. Now, the real challenge with this project, and this was even indicated in the mid-period report program consultation, is I said this project was about developing an accounting framework for less complex entities. The IPSASB right now doesn't know what that accounting framework looks like or what a less complex entity is. So as a result, that's one of the reasons this is a major project. There's going to need to be significant consultation to really develop consensus and work on what those 2 aspects are. On the minor project perspective, the IPSASB put forward 4 projects that it wanted to prioritize. And one point I should make before I dive into these in any detail is, while the IPSASB proposed 6 projects, it doesn't necessarily mean that 6 projects will be added. It'll really come down to what resources are available. These are just the projects that the IPSASB wanted to prioritize and would take on as resources became available. With regards to the minor projects, the first project that was prioritized was IPSAS 21, impairment of non-cash generating assets. In this regard, this would be an update project and a project where the IPSASB would focus on improving this guidance. And the reason why the IPSASB thought it was important to improve this guidance is IPSAS 21 can be difficult to apply in practice. And that's not necessarily a challenge or a problem with the standard itself, but with what the standard is trying to account for. And non-cash generating assets in the public sector are often your public sector assets. So your hospitals, your schools, those assets that obviously aren't generating any cash flows and make measurement very challenging. So as a result, because of the nature of the assets that are encompassed in this standard, it's difficult to apply. So anywhere the IPSASB can clean up the literature to make it easier to apply, the IPSASB thought was a good use of its time. The orange circle, IPSAS 31, intangible assets. Again, this would be another update project. And this was really prioritized as a result of our current measurement project and our natural resource project. From both perspectives, because we have ongoing projects, these identified areas where IPSAS 31 could be improved. one, potentially adding the public sector measurement basis that we'll talk about in the next agenda item. And then from a natural resource perspective, because natural resources right now is really focusing on three aspects, water, mineral resources, and living resources. Updating intangible assets to consider intangible natural resources was another area the IPSASB considered opening up this standard. The green circle, IPSAS 33, because our stakeholders, or we're seeing more and more stakeholders adopt IPSAS, we have more and more real world experience on what those stakeholders have experienced in applying IPSAS 33. And again, as we look forward and we foresee more and more stakeholders applying IPSAS, their entry point into IPSAS is IPSAS 33. And anywhere where the IPSASB can enhance accounting options, take away accounting options, whatever is necessary to make the adoption an easier process is, again, another area where the IPSASB thought it was well worth its efforts. And then the final circle on the bottom right, the blue circle, making materiality judgments. Our stakeholders have indicated that, especially around disclosures in the financial statements, it can be very challenging because many of them take a checklist approach where they'll just go down the list of what's required to be disclosed and tick it off one by one, and not necessarily take into account materiality. So this project will really focus on those materiality judgments and applying professional judgment when deciding what really needs to be disclosed in your financial statements and providing guidance to help make those decisions. So just to recap on how we got here and where we're going, you'll see on the far left here in the first half of 2021, the IPSASB really took its time to prioritize the projects I just went through. And what was interesting from a staff perspective, and maybe you'll remember this, but it was very beneficial for me, very quickly, the IPSASB and everything that it looked on in kind of prioritizing those 6 projects all really pointed to those 6 projects. There wasn't a lot of dissension amongst the views. There was a much longer list of projects developed, but like I said, the more the IPSASB discussed it, the more that we look back on feedback from constituents from previous roundtables, it really just kind of kept on emphasizing the 6 projects that were prioritized. Back in the first half of 2021, the IPSASB did reach out to the PIC and made sure that the PIC agreed with the due process that was going to be followed, and the process that you're looking at right now. All support was received from the PIC, and then we also reached out to the CAG. I think it was in May of 2021. We had a check-in meeting where we talked specifically about the mid-period work program consultation to make sure that we took all the appropriate advice and included that in the document that was ultimately released in June of 2021, which is the second green box from the left in the diagram. As we moved into the second half of 2021, that's where we had our 4-month consultation period. And we also had, as Ross mentioned, you'll see this on the next slide, 4 regional roundtables where one of the major topics covered was this mid-period work program consultation. And we asked a few questions on what those attendees believed were the highest priority projects. That brings us to the next green box with the orange circle around it, or the orange outline, and that really talks about December, where the IPSASB will first look at these responses, and we'll also have the CAG discussion in a few minutes on this as well. And that moves us into March 2022, and I guess February 2022 as well, where the IPSASB will have a check-in meeting, where the IPSASB will really dig into the responses in detail and then determine which projects should be prioritized moving forward on its work program. So what I wanted to summarize here are the 4 roundtables that were held in October. There were 4 held fairly close together in October. We had about 400 attendees across all 4 roundtables. As Ross mentioned, the first one on October 15th was our first Francophone African roundtable. And just to echo Ross's thanks to our French members that use their native French speaking abilities to present. I thought that was really appreciated by by those attendees, instead of having to listen to Rossian and myself be translated to French, they actually got to speak to, or they got to listen to people who spoke natively, and I think it kind of just increased engagement and made the roundtable a better process on our end. Not much else to add from this perspective. I will get into what we heard from each of these roundtables. And what you'll see, these are the two questions that we asked. And the first question, I guess the second question, the first question really focused on what the major projects are and what constituents thought we should prioritize. And the second question focused on the minor projects and what constituents thought was the highest priority project in their jurisdiction. And what I really focused on when I was reviewing these wasn't so much where the priority was. And the reason I say that is because at the end of the day, when the IPSASB has resources available, it's going to have to reevaluate which projects to take on. So the IPSASB itself hasn't actually prioritized projects yet. It wants to wait until resources are available. And the reason I say that is when resources become available, we might have a 3 or 6 month window of resource availability. And even though constituents might really want presentation of financial statements to be our #1 project, if the IPSASB just doesn't have the resources available, we'll take on a project that can actually be accomplished, and that will be one of our minor projects. What I did really focus on, and I'm happy to come back to this in discussion if you want to talk about the priority, was the actual last bullet in each of these questions, and that's the other. And what was interesting to me was that in both cases, you see almost no suggestion for other projects. And that just echoes back to what the IPSASB discussed and the CAG discussed when developing this document. The 6 projects that were prioritized, it's interesting, really were very quickly we reached consensus on what the 6 projects should be. And from these 2 questions, our constituents seem to echo the 6 projects that were put forward. As Thomas mentioned, and these numbers are hot off the press because the consultation exposure period closed on November 30th. But these are the results of the 2 questions that we asked in the consultation. So the first was, do you agree with the major projects proposed? And the second was, do you agree with the minor projects proposed? And just for some background for the CAG, the way that I go through these responses is agrees are really just straight agrees. So the respondent says, I agree, or I agree, and maybe explains why they agree. Whereas a partially agree is I agree, and then they might suggest another project or a reordering, or they generally agree, but they have some other suggestion. And as a result, when I look at those 2 together, you see very strong support for what the IPSASB put forward. I've never seen this before, but I've never seen no disagreements throughout an entire consultation. Now, when I was reviewing these responses and I read the first 2 or 3 of them, I was worried I wouldn't have much to discuss with the CAG. But where the issue really comes through, and I'll ask Ian to touch on this in a second, is other projects that were suggested. I've listed them all here, but the one that really stands out is sustainability. And 44% of our respondents really indicated that sustainability, many of them said it very similar to how Catherine just said it. They thought the IPSASB should publicly discuss it. A project should be added to the work program in some form. And one more point before I stop. The other aspect that was really interesting about sustainability to me is this 44% might actually be a little low because, like I said at the very beginning, the IPSASB took efforts in developing the consultation and had a page or 2 indicating why sustainability wasn't on the agenda right now. And we still heard a number of our constituents come back to us and indicate that sustainability should be a priority and the IPSASB should consider it. Now, the last point I'll make before I turn it over to Ian to provide a little more background, and this kind of ties into my point, is when the IPSASB put this consultation forward, I guess 7 months ago now, 6 or 7 months ago, I feel like sustainability is such a fast-moving topic in, I guess globally, but especially in standard setting. It feels like day to day this changes. So 6 months has been a long time. So Ian, I'll stop sharing and maybe we can get some comments from the IPSASB to hear how things have changed. And then Thomas, back to you to lead us in our discussion.
Thanks, Dave. With that, Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas, for the opportunity just to provide some comments. I mean, I think I'd certainly echo what Dave said, is that this is a topic that's changing daily at the moment. I think there's no doubt that if I looked at one of the key changes during 2021, it would be you know, the fact that it has just become an increasingly important global issue. And I think, you know, probably what's not yet really come through is, even following COP26, is that the public sector is going to have to play a critical role in delivery of climate change targets, because of the extent of its own activities and because of the impact that it has both as a policymaker, a regulator, and also through funding, you know, incentivizing changes in behavior in other sectors. So I think, you know, there's no doubt that this is a really important topic. There's no doubt that sustainability reporting is going to be, you know, really important to the public sector, and I think, you know, certainly the board agrees with that. We have been doing a lot. I think it's important to recognise that. I think it's important to recognise that actually, unlike with the ISB, actually, we've already got relevant literature. So if you look at the existing recommended practice guidelines, recommended practice guideline 3 on reporting service performance is potentially relevant, you know, where you're looking at inputs, outputs, outcomes. Also, RPG 1 reporting on long-term fiscal sustainability is certainly relevant, because ultimately, you know, in order to evaluate what you can change, what you can influence in terms of climate, ultimately will come back to numbers, in my view. You need to put it together for governments in the context of the other programs that they're going to have to take forward, you know, in addition to repairing their finances, dealing with post-pandemic impacts, aging society, and so on. Climate needs to come through in that, and RPG can certainly help in that. We have, during the year, created the sustainability reporting webpage on our website, which brings together the relevant background material and guidance which is already available from other standard assessors as well as IPSASB. And I think it's right to recognise that the Natural Resources Project has started to develop ideas that link to sustainability reporting, and the plan is to approve the consultation paper on that project in March. Now, we certainly strongly support the announcement of the formation of the International Sustainability Standards Board by the IFRS Foundation. It's important to recognise, though, it's been announced, but it's not yet been established. You know, they are still interviewing for a chair and deputy chair or chairs. So those announcements haven't yet been made, let alone getting a board in place. So that will progressively get up and running during 2022. Certainly, we're hoping that will bring coherence to that sort of proverbial alphabet soup of existing standard setting and guidance. But we don't yet have clarity on this, and that will start to emerge during next year. And that's important for us because the IPSASB will focus on producing guidance for private sector capital market participants. And we know from our existing financial reporting standard setting work that where there's relevant guidance that's relevant for the public sector, if the IASB has produced a standard, that really helps us move a project much more quickly than if you know, you have to say that the debate around the formation of the IPSASB was focused on that capital markets perspective. So one of the challenges for 2022 will be to build consensus on the need for sustainability reporting in the public sector and how you do it. Essentially, that's the consultation that the IFRS Foundation did going back over a year or so ago. And we think something similar is going to be required in the public sector. In terms of looking at public sector requirements, as has already been mentioned, I've acted as an observer at the IFRS Foundation's Technical Readiness Working Group meetings, and really trying to make sure that the public sector perspective was in those discussions, and that nothing that would be problematic from the public sector perspective came through in the presentation and the climate change prototype guidance that was then published in November. And certainly it was that guidance that the IPSASB discussed at its private session in September. And really, the reason for that is the board needs a bit of time actually to have its own discussions and form its own views on how this might go forward before we put that out publicly. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges for us during the first quarter of next year, is actually moving private discussions through into the public arena. And it's not just discussions about what do we think of the guidance as that emerges? And let me stress, we don't yet know what IPSASB will produce by way of guidance, although there is provision within the Constitution for the chair and vice chairs to authorise the publication of those prototype standards for consultation and to consult on a work programme. So this is very much a live issue, and it's one that would impact on guidance for the public sector. I think it's important to recognise this is not just a reporting issue. It's part of the broader debate linked to public financial management and the use of resources going forward. So certainly in the debate on the guidance that's needed, it will need to factor in those macroeconomic and budget expert perspectives. And we certainly, from the initial discussions, think there are opportunities to move forward on narrow scope projects, working with those groups that would support the challenges that actually they're facing. So trying to link the reporting with the practical challenges. So we will certainly actively explore those. And we have already had discussions with international organisations and national standard setters. So there's a lot going on at the moment. But I think underlying this is currently no one knows the full nature and extent of what is going to be required in this space. I think we have to be under no illusions that it's not just a case of adding a sustainability project to our work plan. Actually developing a comprehensive suite of sustainability reporting guidance for the public sector would be a major extension of IPSASB's activities, and it would demand additional skills and resources. You only have to look at the fact that the IFRS Foundation chose to set up a separate board in parallel with the IASB, and the extent of the resources being brought into to supporting that new board to see this is major. So it's not just something to be taken lightly. In terms of the projects that we consulted on, I think let's set that side in the context of the fact that we have made big strides towards a comprehensive and consistent suite of financial reporting standards that meet the needs of our constituents. And it's vital that we don't drop the baton on that, whilst at the same time taking forward discussions on the need for and how sustainability reporting guidance for the public sector can be developed. So what I've tried to do is to sort of set out the challenges that we're facing. They are challenges, in terms of what guidance will be needed, what the nature of that guidance is, what the extent of that guidance is. We don't directly have that within our remit at the moment. So there are governance issues, there are resourcing issues. And I think, we need to we're having discussions in all of those spaces at the moment, or are starting discussions in all of those spaces at the moment. And we need to gain consensus amongst the various different constituents before we actually make public pronouncements on that. And there are a lot of different moving parts at the moment. And yes, I can understand the impatience that's being expressed, but I think at the moment we just need some space to have those discussions in private. That's what happened with the IFRS Foundation. Progressively, they pushed the debate out and made decisions based on feedback from constituents. And I think, you know, there's going to be a need for the same to happen for the public sector. And, you know, I think based on where we are at the moment, certainly there's likely to be an opportunity to, you know, summarise what the way forward may be. Probably in March, I know it's likely to be discussed at the OECD Accrual Symposium in March, and there's the board meeting after that. So I think at the moment, that's the sort of time frame that we're aiming for. So, you know, I hope that's helped. I don't think we can go much further than that at the moment. Certainly, we'll be interested to hear comments today, but I would particularly welcome comments as well on the existing financial reporting standards work programme and the very interesting results that Dave has shown us from the consultation. So with that, Thomas, you know, obviously back to you. I don't doubt this will raise discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I think that has been really helpful to kind of sort things in where we are, where you are at the moment, and what is the frame of the discussion or for the discussion of today. I think that was really helpful. Dave, anything left from your intro? No, okay. So with that, then we can open up the discussion. First Anwar, then Paul, and then Karen.
Thank you, Thomas. It's very, I think Ian explained the situation scenario very explicitly. Yeah, there are certain things that do crop to mind. Ian, you have stated in the agenda item 2.1 that IPSASB has been started holding regular sessions. These are the internal sessions you have mentioned, like one taking place in last September. Yeah, I was just wondering, don't you reckon that it's time now that IPSASB also interfaces with the Global Reporting Initiative and see if they can provide some resources to the IPSASB in terms of developing guidance in the future? Because both the IFRS Sustainability Reporting Standards Board, the GRE itself, as well as the UNCTAD ISA cater for the private sector. Then, you know, I think it's time that either from the IFAC itself or IPSASB on behalf of the IFAC makes the way forward, you know, in a space of time in the foreseeable future. In which case, going back to Dave's presentation, you know, then don't we reckon that we can also bring that in as a minority, you know, prioritized project in terms of IPSASB's future, you know, work program? And you know, GRI has been spreading the, you know, the guidance as well as interacting with the various stock markets worldwide and coming out with a series of webinars, you know. And whereas in terms of GDP contribution and in terms of the overall global impact, I think the public sector has a greater role and a greater impact, a role to play and a greater impact to bear for these sustainable reporting standards future implementation. You know, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That's helpful. I kind of recommend that we collect some comments and then I pass it over to either Ross or Ian. And if members can kind of also give just some feedback regarding the financial reporting projects, which Dave just introduced, and the comments we received from constituents, I think that would be helpful if you were supportive, or what's your impression regarding that? So Paul, then Karen, then Fabienne.
Thank you, Thomas, and thanks for all the contributions today, and thanks to the IPSASB also for giving us a chance to have a midterm review of the strategy. I think that's very important from the point of view of keeping up to date with developments such as sustainability reporting, which I'll talk about in a short while. In respect to the consultation itself, we did actually make a couple of points, and it was interesting to see during the slides that there were no other projects presented. One of the points we did make was perhaps it would have been useful if the other projects that the board had considered and rejected had also made it into the final midterm review, as that would have perhaps indicated the train of thought that the board had for future projects. And we also had some issues with trying to differentiate what would be a major and minor project on the basis that this was an internal resources generated issue, which is something difficult for outside stakeholders to really establish as to what the workload for the staff would be for those. So that's just a couple of comments from the overall consultation itself. In respect to the financial reporting side of things, we were largely in full agreement with the major and the minor projects. It's interesting, actually, the one project we did have some slight doubts about was the IPSAS 33, but having seen the consultation, the responses to the events that you had in October, perhaps that was perhaps too much of a European-centric viewpoint for that. So we stand advised on that. We thought very much that the differential reporting, the presentation of financial statements, and the materiality minor project all sort of went hand in hand together anyway. So we certainly supported the work on those. And I don't know how helpful this will be to the board, but there was a lot of support for differential reporting amongst our membership, albeit there was a great deal of issues highlighted with just how difficult this is going to be for the board to decide on a route forward. And we fully supported with the concentration on the scope as an initial step for the board. So I think that deals with the more financial reporting side of things. In respect to the sustainability reporting, we were very, very strongly supportive of the IPSASB being more involved in this. We appreciate the constraints that the IPSASB has on resources. I personally don't think we need another sustainability standards board, be it private sector or public sector. We've had many of these for many years, and it's not really helped matters. So we fully support the IPSASB being involved in the IPSASB's work, but also note what Anwar mentioned about the GRI. I think sometimes they're a bit overlooked in this. My slight concern regards natural resources, and there's a couple of points I'd like to raise with the board on this, because the CAG's not really going to have a chance to discuss this again before the consultation paper in March. We mentioned in the paper that we think there should be a stronger link between what used to be called non-financial reporting, but say sustainability reporting, and the financial accounts. And it strikes me particularly that natural resources is an obvious candidate for this. So from my personal point of view, I maybe would regard it as a bit of a lost opportunity, and maybe even perhaps not good for the reputation if the consultation paper that should be issued in March didn't canvass stakeholders as to whether they think things like natural capital reporting would be relevant for such things as living assets, for instance, or carbon reporting would be relevant for the subsoil resources, at least to gauge some sort of initial feedback from stakeholders as to whether the natural resources project should start to take those into consideration, because there's obviously financial impacts from an asset recognised for subsoil resources where there's going to be considerable carbon output from it. I also wonder if the board, and I appreciate that the board will be, and Ian will be feeding into the IPSASB with public sector specific specificities in respect to sustainability. I wonder if the board actually has an idea of these, because it's something we mentioned in our response letter to the midterm review, that perhaps this would be an interesting thing to see at an early stage and something to prioritise as to actually what the public sector specificities that would be presented to the IPSASB would be. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul, for that. Karen, and then Agnieszka. No,
Thanks.
sorry, Fabienne. No, Karen, Fabienne, Agnieszka. Sorry, in that order.
Thank you, Thomas. This feels like quite a big area, so I'll try and keep my comments brief so that others can contribute. In terms of the items that were in the mid-year review, I'm kind of not surprised to see IPSAS 33, and I think that, you know, if we're encouraging people to adopt the standards, things that we can do to help them feel right to be kind of at the top of the pile, to make that come together. You'll recall that I was an advocate of differential reporting being on the mid on the program, and so I'm still think that should be a priority for the board. And I think there is a question for me about to what extent are we looking beyond the current strategy period, because you know, even as a major project, I don't think that we would be able to complete it within the term of this strategy period, and I would be disappointed if we weren't able to even start on it ahead of that. So I think it would be good if the board and secretariat could be thinking about those things that might be commenced in this strategy period that then would be then taken forward into the next one, rather than feeling that it has to be something that can be achieved and delivered within the current strategy period. So that's kind of my first sort of main point on the program itself. On sustainability, you know, well, that's a big topic. We probably could spend all day talking about that. And you might recall that CIPFA did a research piece to try and find out what was happening in the public sector on sustainability, and we found that even those that participated, that there's a big gap between actually what perhaps should be there and what people are doing at the moment. But we also found it was a really complex landscape, and so I think it's something that we need, you know, I think the board needs to be careful about in terms of getting into and actually understand the implications of it, because certainly we found that there's a lot of people involved in sustainability and sustainability reporting that go beyond the normal people that we would interact with. So I think there's a whole set of things to think about in terms of, well, actually, who are the community that the board might need to engage with on this. And you might argue that the IFRS Foundation have kind of put a marker down in putting sustainability alongside financial reporting, and there are sort of natural bedfellows in some ways, but not in others. And you know, I think there's big implications for that, and I think there's things for the board to look at in terms of its capacity to be able to deal with these things, whether it takes it on in terms of the main board itself or whether it's a separate board. There's clearly capacity issues, both from a resource and financial perspective, that need thinking about. I think it would be something that would be useful for the CAG to have a separate discussion on, in terms of what do we see from a user and a practitioner perspective in terms of the issues facing the sector. I probably have less confidence that the new Sustainability Standards Board and the IFRS Foundation will deal with public sector issues, or at least deal with them first off, because it's been set up to deal with capital markets. So I really do think there is a gap there. There's an urgency there, but actually there needs to be, in my view, a set of thinking that needs to precede that to actually set ourselves up best for success. But I think this is a much bigger conversation that it would be useful to have at some point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. I think you responded in a couple of points to what Ian just introduced in terms of capacity, in terms of new knowledge needed, in terms of new kind of contacts and communities to speak to. And I think that was exactly what Ian was alluding to, and what makes it much more difficult than just saying this is a work program issue and we should add a project. I think you couldn't have phrased it better. Ross, I would just ask you to come in for a second regarding Karen's question regarding or concerning the strategy period, because I think that probably is a misunderstanding We are not talking about projects which kind of are able to be finalized within the current strategy period, right?
No, you're right. It's more if they would be started before the end of this current project period. As you'll see from the outrun on most of our projects, if they require a CP stage, we're talking 4 or 5 years for the finish of a project if it runs smoothly, sometimes longer. But yeah, it's definitely whether they'll be started before the end of the strategic period or not.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. I just wanted to clarify that, Karen, before there's a deeper misunderstanding regarding that. I think that would be a little bit too ambitious to talk only about projects which are to be finalized until end of 2023. Fabienne, then Agnieszka, then Kevin.
Thanks, Thomas. As to the work program consultation, I do support the vote of the respondents for casting light on the presentation of financial statements project. On a more general note, I wanted to mention 4 areas of concern to me, and that in some sense, in my opinion, may directly relate to a review of IPSAS1. First, with respect to sustainability reporting, and thank you to Jan for the information he provided earlier. I just wanted to underline that one of the key upfront issues is whether IPSASB will follow the same processes for accounting standards, meaning convergence with the private sector, except where the public sector would differ, or will the IPSASB try and elaborate standards for the public sector, for instance, based on the IPSASB RPGs I mentioned earlier, and only whenever issues are the same, look at the private sector. I fully understand that the second process is far more resource consuming than the first, but I believe that this is a critical issue to settle before any work is started. And I understand Jan talks about a consultation, but I'm not quite sure I fully got the message here. Second, with respect to closing the gap with statistical standards, I understand that as part of the SNA update project, intangible assets are under focus. And I also understand that this is a current topic in the private sector and an important one, and that relates to value creation. Is there a plan for the IPSASB to also work on this topic and beyond the minor project on the consultation, work program consultation on IPSAS 31? Third, from where I sit, I can see that there are a lot of discussions worldwide currently revolving around fiscal risk identification and assets and liabilities management. And I would think that this is an area that would benefit from maybe further attention from a standard setting viewpoint somehow, as it directly relates to information on financial statements and sustainability as well. And is there any plan to tackle such a subject? I know it's very wide, but I mean, as you say, it's the context that is very sort of going all directions. And finally, a shared concern has been hanging over the use of financial statements by parliamentarians for quite some time now. And I would think that maybe in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, it could be a good time to figure out some overall action and to educating and convincing those users that financial information based on accrual accounting is key to sound political decisions. Within some focused joint efforts, help things moving forward somehow. Again, more questions on the difficulties than solutions here, but and I'm fully aware that this will ask for a lot of resources. A lot of resources will be needed on that to follow on all those fronts. So a lot of work ahead, I think. Thank you.
I think we've lost Thomas again, so I think we'll move on now to Agnieszka.
Yes, thank you, Ross. Just a short question of clarification for Dave, I guess. The project on differentiation reporting is a very important one. Can you clarify my understanding, Dave, on the feedback from the constituents? Because 16% it wouldn't mean that only 16% perceive this project as important, but that's just 16% rank this project at the very first position. The other ones prefer at the very first position the financial presentation project. So the effect would be, it's important, it's still very important project, but not at the very first rank. As this is also for my jurisdiction, the project which is very important, I will be very grateful for clarification. And since I have the floor, just very shortly, support for the overall proposal and support for the involvement in sustainability issues with all the constraints that were already discussed. Thank you.
Thanks, Agnieszka. Any immediate reaction, Dave?
So Agnieszka, I would just say your interpretation is right. The question that you're referring to was a question we asked the round table, and we asked those participants what was most important in their jurisdiction. And you're right, 83% said presentation of financial statements, and I think 16% said differential reporting. I'd say, Agnieszka, the key point I took away was, I can't remember if it was 1% or 0%, but there was very limited identification of any other projects. And the only point I'd emphasize, Agnieszka, is when the board does have resources available, we will take into account what constituents said, but I think it'll really come back to what resources are available and the environment that the board is operating at the time. So things might change next year when we have resources available. And this was just a snapshot of a few regions that we presented to.
Thanks, Dave. Dave, can I ask you to read what Inge just wrote in the chat and to bring that in later? Because obviously she's in the train and she can't speak up. Key, and then Kevin, before handing over to Tim.
Thanks, Chair. I just have a very short comment. Overall, I think a mid-period work program is perfect and all the projects are necessary. The only mini suggestion is that if the resource is limited for IPSASB, the minor project making materiality judgments could be combined with the major project presentation of financial statements. It's because this minor project aims to improve the relevance and the usefulness of the information in the notes to the financial statements. However, the current IPSAS 1 financial statement presentation, which is also a major project in mid-period work program, has stimulated the content disclosed in the notes to financial statements. And the purpose of a major project is to revise the overall requirements for the presentation of financial statements. Therefore, the minor project can be a part of the major project. And IPSASB has a potential opportunity to achieve the purpose of minor projects through carrying on the major projects. Thank you.
Thanks, Key, for highlighting the interfaces between and the relationships between the projects. I think this is something Dave already mentioned as well, and certainly the board will look at that. Kevin, Tim, then Jeffrey.
Thank you, Thomas. I agree with Key. I think that the list of projects, major and minor, it's a very impressive list. It's an important list. They're fundamental issues. You could see the support from the consultations, and I think the presentation by Dave. I think what I heard from Ian is, and I think what needs to be discussed at the board is policy relevance. I think there's really not much on that major and minor project list that kind of really speaks to these forward-looking issues, of which sustainability is one, both fiscal and environmental. I think these discount rates, I think, are going to get revisited in the next few years as we grapple with inflation and what does that mean in terms of how we plan for the future. And I think this broader issue, which is of tax gaps, which are linked to fiscal sustainability, are also important. I think all communities, whether it's this new board being set up to look at sustainability, or the community that I come from, which is more macro fiscal, we're all grappling with how to figure out how to provide better frameworks so that politicians can make better decisions dealing with sustainability issues. So like in the case of my community, macro fiscal, we have not done a good job in terms of providing those fiscal planning frameworks. What does, these potential climate impacts, what will it do to fiscal sustainability going forward and environmental sustainability? So we're all working on these issues. So I'm very empathetic, but I would worry about the issue of policy relevance. If you have a minor project list that looks like that, this is going to take us up for the next 3 years. Like, that list has to be representative of the issues we're going to be grappling with over the next 10 years, of which obviously climate change and fiscal sustainability are 1 and 2. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Tim, then Jeffrey, and then I would ask Dave to bring in Inge's point.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, I mean, I want to follow on from what Kevin is saying, and I think some of the points I was making is, I mean, we're going to be around this, but I think, one of the key things in terms of policy relevance is how financial statements are being used in decision making. But I think something like sustainability is difficult to deal with on its own, and it's when the term a cross-cutting issue and needs to be integrated in anything we do. But in terms of the project, let's say on presentation of financial statements, one of the questions I was having is what degree are consultations going on with stakeholders outside the accountancy profession in terms of the users of, and that's one of the things we've been thinking about in the World Bank, is how can we better articulate how accrual-based financial statements can be used for better decision making, whether at the macro fiscal level or overall by ministries of finance in terms of their budgetary decision making, or by entities themselves in improving delivery and making that articulating that better. And I think central to that is how one presents financial statements in a way that are useful to people outside the accountancy profession as well as inside. So one of my questions is the degree to which consultations plan to be held, or whether you're thinking about holding consultations outside the normal sort of accountancy profession, let's say, with people responsible for macro fiscal policy or budget making or different types of entities in themselves. And I think that links to differentiated reporting as well, is what information do decision makers need to make better decisions, and what value can accrual add to that? And I think we need to be thinking about that. And also, from day one in that context, sustainability reporting is key, because those are some of the issues that need to be dealt with. So I think it's that brings on to sustainability. We're supported. This needs to be on the IPSASB agenda, but it's not something you can, as someone said, do by a project. It needs to be integrated in everything that one is doing, and also how existing standards are interpreted. But anyway, I mean, generally it's supported, but I think this issue of policy relevance that Kevin mentioned is key.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think it's always important to kind of have the users in mind, and how can we facilitate the best use of the accrual financial information, which is provided with financial statements. Ross, do you want to kind of respond immediately regarding the financial statement presentation topic and the consultation scope or focus Tim was alluding to?
Maybe we'll wait till we go through everyone and we can come back holistically, if that's
right. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. A little bit mindful of time, but let's take Jeffrey, Dave, and then I'm finishing off with Ian and Ross.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I won't say anything about sustainability or differential reporting. I think they're both extremely important topics, and I don't think I can add to what everybody else has said. I was just a bit curious about the IPSAS 21 update, the impairment of non-cash generating assets, because this seems very similar to the sort of measurement topics, the ED 77 and 78, and I just wonder why it's being done separately. Can't it all be done somehow together? So a very simple question. Second point is that I need to leave the meeting now for about half an hour, so for which I apologize, but I will be back. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Putting a very simple question on the table and leaving, this is most appreciated. Actually, I think it's not a simple question, and the answer will probably not be as simple as you might think. So thanks for asking that. I think that's a very good question. I leave it to Ian and Ross at the end. Dave, bringing in quickly Inge's point, highlighting that nothing came from Rosa regarding a mid-period work program.
Thomas, I can just respond to Jeffrey quickly because we did have a discussion before you drop off. As part of our discussions last year, and these were included in our conceptual framework discussions, we were talking about one of the measurement bases is value in use, which is applied in IPSAS 21. And we started to rework it. And honestly, Jeffrey, what it came down to is the project started to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and we just couldn't close it down to get the exposure out. So we thought the best way to deal with it was to propose this project separately in the mid-period work program consultation in order to move measurement forward and to appropriately focus on IPSAS 21 when we had the resources available. So it's interesting because we did talk about it and we wanted to deal with it separately so we could really put the appropriate attention on it.
So the answer to this simple question is it's not as simple as that, and therefore they postponed it. Dave, sorry, get going.
To bring in Ms. Grassel's comments, I think it's really interesting, and I think something for the IPSASB to consider. She indicated that, I don't know whether opportunity is the right word, but we have a robust accounting framework now, and bringing in, she sees this climate change initiative or sustainability reporting as an opportunity to change our robust accounting framework into something that's softer and not as robust, and kind of layer on these green initiatives. And it was really a warning to the board to make sure that that's considered in developing or moving forward with sustainability, which I think is an interesting comment.
Thanks, Dave. So with that, I think wrapping up with Ian and Ross, and then we will have a break.
So thanks, Thomas. I mean, I think actually Dave's point, and based on Inge's comment, actually is entirely right, and it does sort of link into the challenge that the board has had on natural resources, because the real challenge is the interface between what you can put on a balance sheet and what is certainly relevant in accountability terms and is certainly relevant in terms of forward fiscal sustainability. And that's really what we're exploring in natural resources. And I think, just to provide some reassurance on that, we certainly, are setting that in the context of, sustainability and where that might go and the relevance of the RPGs and so on. So there certainly is discussion of that. Just picking up the points about relevance in terms of financial statements, I think certainly, although, there's a fair way to go in terms of scoping that project, in the discussions, informal discussions we've had, I think, we absolutely recognise that this is going to need to bring in emerging experience in this area. It certainly needs to bring in the kind of whole questions about coverage of financial statements, links to budget, relevance in terms of statistical reporting. And I would just make a shout out there for a very good research paper that's just been produced by one of the CAG members, Frans van Schaik, it's just about to be published, I think, France, in Public Money and Management, and it very much looks into this area. And I think we see that as one of the really important inputs to our work in the area. I think it's just sort of wrapping up on sustainability. I think it has been really interesting to hear the comments made by CAG members. And I think, certainly that broad support for us moving forward the debate on this, notwithstanding those big strategic questions. And I think that's going to be really important as we move into next year. I think the conversation that CAG has had today will, certainly support us as we move through, as I said, moving those debates from the private arena through to the public arena. during the beginning of next year. And I think, that's given us some really good things to think about. And we certainly will want to, continue to talk about the, sustainability reporting with the CAG as we evolve our thinking in that space. So I would just say thank you very much to the CAG members for comments both on sustainability, but also the insights in terms of content and linkages of those projects that we're proposing to add to the work programme. And if I could just make one point, difference between major and minor, basically the major projects will certainly need to go through the full process, consultation paper, exposure draft, final pronouncement. The minor projects are likely to be just exposure draft and then final pronouncement.
Thanks, Ian, for clarifying that. Ross, final comments before we break?
Yeah, not much more to add to what Dave and Ian have both already said. The one thing I would note is I think the discussion we've just had probably justifies a little bit more why we're still having internal conversations, because it is a pretty complex landscape at the moment. And although we're not overly public on what we're going to do strategically, we have made quite a few public statements. So Ian noted earlier that we've got a couple position pieces where he's put out there. And I think the important points that we have been public on are the ones that Ms. Grassel noted in her comment in the chat, is the importance in linking sustainability to financial resources and financial statements in some way, so that it doesn't become a distraction from the need in the public sector to adopt accrual accounting. I think that no matter what we end up doing will be one of the fundamental statements that we'll continue to make. It shouldn't become a distraction from what we're trying to do and get governments to report on a better accrual accounting information and use that information for decision-making purposes. So we'll continue to harp on that point, and that is a public point we make on our sustainability website now. I think it's important to note that. So although we haven't talked about what might eventuate as projects or how we might take it forward, we're quite clear strategically on the importance of good finances and the public sector role in allowing progress on programs related to sustainability. And I think that is important. And the point that Ian just made that I wanted to emphasize again, the great input we've just received now on the projects we might start, particularly the major projects. No feedback on any of the thoughts at the moment, but we'll take note of all those points as we think and scope those projects and start the research phase. The major projects will include a consultation paper, which will explore a number of options. So we don't know the direction we're going to go on any project yet, but we'll make sure to consider the CAG input as we scope and think those projects through, so that we end up with a consultation program paper that covers that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. I think that really reiterates the statement Ian just made earlier to say non-financial reporting and sustainability is incredibly important, but we shouldn't lose focus on financial reporting projects by kind of having these discussions about the topics around sustainability. So thank you for that. I think it has been a very rich discussion. I think a lot of food for thought. I'm really already looking forward to the detailed minutes because I think they will be very rich, reflecting what just has been brought up. With that, I suggest we have a break, and actually, I think we can have a break until 10 to the full hour. So in my time zone, it's 1:50, whatever time zone is for you, but it's 50. So grab a coffee, recover, and come back 10 to the full hour, please.
1 minute remaining in the break. 1 minute.
So thank you everybody for coming back. I hope you had a coffee or tea or some oxygen, whatever brings you back to life. We have another agenda item going on, which is quite interesting. And this is the measurement suite of projects, ED 76 to 79. And in order not to lose more time, I immediately hand over to Dave to introduce us to the topic and the issues we are going to discuss. Dave, please.
Thanks, Thomas. And similar to agenda item 3, which we just discussed, this topic isn't quite as hot off the press as the mid-period work program consultation, but we did just receive comments back about a month ago. So again, the CAG's the first group to get a chance to comment. So I'll go through and provide a background again, but not to the same extent as the mid-period work program consultation. And then I'll try to identify the issues so that we can really engage the CAG and discuss the issue that I think the IPSASB is going to struggle with, because it's well, the public sector measurement basis is an important initiative that's being put forward, and it's difficult developing things from scratch. So anything that the CAG can provide will be very helpful for the board moving forward. So with that, I'll start with a brief background. I really just wanted to step back and remind members that the measurement suite of EDs was issued as a package. It was made up of 4 exposure drafts. Starting in the middle, exposure draft 77, measurement was really, I'll say, what brought these 4 projects together. There was a common measurement link throughout all of them. This project started back in 2017. And what was interesting about this project, when we first issued the consultation paper, we issued an illustrative exposure draft that went along with that. We talked to the CAG a few times about that, and I think this was a really good project to try out an illustrative exposure draft. I think it showed some of the benefits when the circumstances are right, and something the CAG mentioned after it went out was illustrative exposure drafts seem to be a really good approach when the IPSASB has some very firm preliminary views and can spend time developing an illustrative exposure draft, because in some cases it can be a waste of time if those views aren't firm enough. In this case, it really benefited us, and you'll see that as we move through the comments. On the far left, we have exposure draft 76. This was an update of the conceptual framework, specifically chapter 7, as it relates to measurement. And then when I move to the right-hand side, we had, I'll call it an update of our property, plant, and equipment guidance. And this really started as our heritage and infrastructure project, but as we saw more and more links to measurement, we decided it'd be good to link to measurement. And then finally, on the bottom right, we have exposure draft 79, which was non-current assets held for sale and discontinued operations. And there's certain measurement aspects in there as well. So as a result, it was all issued as a package. Constituents were generally supportive of these being issued as a package. They thought it was useful to see the principles flow throughout the guidance. And then from analyzing the respondents' perspective, what was very useful, and you'll see this when we actually get to the responses, is there was general support for the proposals that were put forward throughout this suite of exposure drafts. And what I've really highlighted today is the one that's kind of permeates throughout all 4 exposure drafts that we wanted CAG input on, and ultimately where I think the IPSASB is going to spend much of 2022 cleaning this up. So the key proposals, and I won't necessarily go through these in any detail. There's 1 or 2 I really want to touch on, but these exposure drafts did propose, especially from a measurement perspective, 5 key proposals. And the 2 that I really wanted to touch on start in the middle of the page. And the 3rd item down is fair value as a measurement basis. Going back to CAG advice, I think from the Luxembourg meeting, going back a few years, probably 3 or 4 years ago now, a suggestion that's really stuck with the IPSASB, and I think is a great advice, is where we mean the same thing and we use the same term as the private sector, we really should lean into that term and make sure that we apply that term consistently. And as a result, the IPSASB proposed bringing in fair value as defined in the private sector and using it in the public sector where it makes sense, where the transactions are the same as the private sector. And what was really important here is when we proposed this in the consultation paper, respondents strongly supported this. They indicated that where fair value was appropriate to apply in the public sector, it should be used. The concept was well understood, and it was a good use of IPSASB resources not to reinvent the wheel. But the flip side of that, and this is what really stuck out, coming out of the consultation paper, and this is not related to the ED yet, they indicated that while they supported fair value was not appropriate in all cases in the public sector, specifically those cases where assets were held for their service capacity. So good examples that the board talked about a lot are hospitals, schools, a lot of roads where, again, these assets are held for the public to deliver services, not necessarily to generate cash flows. And because fair value measures the value that could be received to sell an asset, that might not be the most useful information to users of the financial statements. It's not as useful to know how much you could sell a hospital or a school for when it's providing a service that needs to be provided on an ongoing basis. Now, the important point to take away, and again, I'll get into this a little later, but 4 of these 5 proposals in the exposure draft, again, were very strongly supported. Where there was comments was on the public sector measurement basis. And what I'll do for the next 2 slides is give a little more background on current operational value and the proposals there, just so the CAG is fully up to date on what those proposals were. So current operational value, like I mentioned, really received its genesis from comments received on fair value. Current operational value was developed specifically for the public sector. It was designed to address the unique aspects of assets held in the public sector. And I talked about schools and hospitals, and this is what the IPSASB really focused on. These are the examples that the IPSASB would discuss over and over again. And it comes back to what I just said, that while fair value can be applied, it can be used to calculate the value of any asset or liability. The IPSASB questioned, and I guess respondents questioned in their response to the consultation paper, whether it was the most useful information for the users of that financial information. So again, if I calculate the fair value of a hospital, that would be the value that you could sell the hospital for. That might not be the most useful information for financial statement users, who might not be as concerned with how much the hospital could be sold for, but the value of the service that it provides. And that's really what current operational value is trying to focus on. What's the value of the asset in the way that the entity is using it to deliver those service delivery objectives at the measurement date. So the real key and the differentiating factor of current operational value from fair value is that it focuses on measuring the asset in its current use. So going back to my hospital example, current operational value would value that asset as a hospital, whereas fair value would value that asset in its highest and best financial use, which might be something else. So the hospital might easily be able to be converted into an office building, and you might be able to generate more profits in that regard. That wasn't seen as a useful measurement from the perspective of current operational value. And as a result, that's why we focus on the current use. The only reason I wanted to put this diagram in, and I won't speak too much to it because it's in the paper as well, is I just wanted to remind members where current operational value sat in the subsequent measurement hierarchy that was proposed by the IPSASB. And current operational value, I guess as the name suggests, is it sits under the current value model. So it's a current value measurement. It's updated every single measurement period. And it's one of 3 options that are available to measure the current value of an asset or liability, but in this case, an asset. It sits beside fair value. And I guess the key point that I always like to emphasize with this diagram is current operational value is trying to present a measurement in a different way and provide a different type of information. The comments that were received on current operational value, and sorry, just before I get into this, I just want to reiterate that the rest of the proposals, it's really, I shouldn't say surprising, but they were very strongly supported. And I think there's always some work to do on cleaning up the proposals and taking into account respondent comments. But I think the IPSASB can really deal with those in the first half of 2022. And I think where the biggest challenge for 2022 is going to be is current operational value and the way forward. And I think regardless of the path forward that is taken, I think it's going to be resource intensive. It's going to be challenging because there's lots of aspects to balance in the comments and really trying to get build consensus and get current operational value right. With regards to current operational value, some of the comments, obviously some of the comments were supportive of the proposals, but some of the comments that I really wanted to discuss with the CAG are related to some jurisdictions that didn't believe current operational value was necessary at all. And this goes back to the view that fair value can be applied in the public sector context in all circumstances. The second comment that really came through is that a number of jurisdictions said they saw a lot of similarities between current operational value and fair value. They saw a lot of similarities between current operational value and replacement cost. And the recommendation from a number of constituents was just use replacement cost. It's a well understood measurement technique or base, and that could be a useful method to use going forward. And then finally, the third comment that came through commonly on current operational value is since current operational value shares many characteristics with fair value, and fair value is a technically complex measurement basis, introducing current operational value is also a very complex measurement basis, and it would be challenging for constituents to have to deal with these two robust but complex measurement bases. Now, what all these comments really laid the basis for were three recommended ways forward that are laid out in the paper that you would have read before this meeting. And on the far left, it was support for the proposals in the exposure draft. And that was, I'd say to a large extent, go forward with what's proposed and clean up things around the edges. So it might clean up the definition, add more examples, clarify where appropriate. In the middle, we had a number of respondents who really supported I'll call it the general principle around current operational value. They did really strongly believe that there was a measurement basis that was required in the public sector. A number of assets held in the public sector have different characteristics in the private sector, and a different measurement basis was required. They liked the direction that current operational value was going, but it should be, I guess, cleaned up or made more relevant, clarified, so that it was more appropriately applied in the public sector. And then on the far right, we have depart from the proposals. And that really goes back to the three comments that I read on the previous slide. And this really comes back to a number of constituents just either not believing that a public sector measurement basis was necessary, or that the IPSASB should move to a measurement basis such as replacement costs that already exist and is well established. So one last point, sorry, on this slide before I move to the questions. What was interesting from a reviewer perspective is that each of these categories received about a third of support. And while I don't necessarily like to go into the numbers this early in the process, I think it's important to really focus on the major issues. It was interesting that there was no clear path forward in that regard. With regard to the questions that were put forward to the CAG, there were three put forward, but I think two really work well together. The first was, do CAG members think the IPSASB should continue developing a public sector specific measurement basis? And then secondly, if yes, do CAG members think the IPSASB should continue exploring current operational value as a public sector specific measurement basis? So Thomas, I'll turn it back over to you, and maybe it's easiest if we go through each question individually, and then I can come back and discuss the third question after that.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, for that very clear presentation containing drastic pictures for the departure of current operational value. I think it's best as you proposed. Let's go through the questions individually and start with the first question, asking the question, kind of, should the board continue developing a public sector specific measurement basis, or, and that's kind of embedded in that question, is fair value good in all circumstances to be applied? So can I have responses or reactions, comments regarding that? Fabienne first, Agnieszka, and then Janique.
Hi, I'm sorry, our work's in my building, so I hope you're not going to hear too much noise. So just let me know if this is unbearable. This is unbearable to me, but I hope it doesn't go through to you. So I give it a try. So I believe there is room as well as some need actually to develop a current measurement basis that is different from fair value. And I would advise against shaping fair value to fit a public sector purpose. This is because I think that it would increase confusion on the use of fair value that is already complex to implement for a vast majority of stakeholders in the public sector. And it also would not serve the difference between financial and operational capacities that is highly meaningful in the public sector. So definitely, yes, there's a need to define another current value than fair value. However, I identified two potentially confusing issues from a practical standpoint while discussing with the stakeholders in France, which is also on the current operational value, which are that first, stakeholders were concerned that the difference with replacement costs was not clear enough, and second, the definition might not be fully operational, the actual definition. For instance,
Fabienne,
how can a reliable, yeah.
Could you hold this comment back to a little bit at a later stage?
Okay.
Because I
Later.
think for the
Okay.
moment, we just want to clarify whether there's support for the development of a public sector specific measurement base. And then I think we go more into the detail of comprehensive current operational value. If you don't mind.
That's fine for me.
Okay,
so,
thank
you.
Thanks. So Agnieszka, then Janique, and then Paul.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. So before I answer directly to the question, I think I have to make a declaration. So first of all, I have to declare that I'm a proponent of one accounting for public and private sector on the conceptual level whenever it's possible, wherever it's possible. So there are plenty of public sector specificities, and we know that. That's why we have IPSAS. But I dare to say that most public sector specificities are connected with applying major context in the public sector environment. That's in my ideal world, accounting world, the concepts are are sector neutral. So the concept can be applied in different environments. And if we refer to some other issues that seem to be public sector specific on the level of concepts, let's remind ourselves about discussion on heritage assets or infrastructure assets. The first discussion that we had on that issue were whether we need a different category of assets, because these are typical for the public sector, and that's why we need some additional categories. After a lot of discussions, it seems that we came to quite a different conclusions. We have guidance why specific heritage assets, this type of assets, or infrastructure assets in the environment of the public sector have to be put to one of the categories that we already know. That's why we have guidance. That's why we don't have special categories. Sorry for the long introduction, but I wanted to give you some kind of a flavor of my thinking. And thinking here is very similar. I would be really cautious to introduce a new measurement basis in the public sector context. That wouldn't mean that we shouldn't be putting into practice some of the ideas that are already in the documents, but the question is whether they should really be labeled as a new public sector management. But maybe otherwise, maybe they should be just a flavor of existing measurement basis that should be applicable in the public sector environment. And one more comment, that may be a bit deficit of knowledge of my side, but when I was reading the documents, so I was a bit confused. Why were we discussing this first question together with the second question, whether instead we should modify or apply fair value to the public sector environment? As I was reading the documents, I would feel a lot of sympathy with those that referred to this current operational value being closer to replacement cost. So I'm not sure whether the second part of the question is quite clear for me. So to sum up, one accounting whenever possible. Maybe we should think of putting some of the issues to the IPSAS literature, but is it really a new measurement basis, or should it be labeled like that? Thank you.
Thank you, Agnieszka. I think that was quite interesting, quite helpful. If I understand you correctly, then probably you would argue for the recommendation in paragraph 16, C 2, which is meaning fair value should be amended for the public sector and guidance should be updated to reflect the unique characteristics of public sector assets. This is more the direction you are going to, if I understand you correctly.
I'm not sure whether that's 100% that, because of the close relationship to the replacement cost. So it depends on the issue that we're considering, and it would be more complicated than that. Yeah, sorry about that.
Right, thank you. Janique, then Paul, then Kevin.
Thank you. Agnieszka's introduction was very relevant to the point that I wanted to make as well. I think that the direction that we've taken took place at a meeting before I joined the CAG. And so my first question when I started reading is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? I understand it, but I wonder if the problem is big enough to warrant yet another measurement method. Because what I am concerned about is that, the comparability of financial statements, the complexity of implementing this as a practitioner in the public service. And I think that some of the suggestions that have been introduced in terms of using replacement costs, and when I was trying to understand what COV was all about, the only analogy I could make was it's akin to replacement costs, and that is already a notion that exists. And so I would propose that we don't complicate the landscape further in terms of all of the menus that are available for public sector, and that we try to adapt what some of the known knowledge and concepts are. And thank you.
Thank you, Janique. Paul, Kevin, then Franz.
Thank you, Chair. Along with Agnieszka and Janique, we also support alignment of private and public sector standards where absolutely available, where absolutely possible, and in particular in respect of IFRS 13 conversion fair value. But we do think that there are public sector specificities that potentially make fair value inappropriate for some public sector assets, those used for operational capacity in particular, including the highest and best use of the asset, as pointed out by the board, and the market-based basis of the method as opposed to entity-specific. Also, other public sector specificities such as assets being held for service potential and not for resale reasons, specialised assets, restrictions on use, and indeed the requirement to actually provide services where they might not be economically viable in the private sector. So we think all of these justify the development of a public sector specific current value measurement process. We also appreciate that it might be possible to flex or enhance IFRS 13 compatible fair value, but we're concerned that that eventually would lead to a divergence in the standard or the guidance sufficient that it actually makes the comparability between transactions or assets of a very, very similar type between the private and public sector less consistent, which is the main reason that we support complete alignment wherever possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for your plea for a public sector specific measurement basis. Kevin, Franz, and Karen.
So I support this work. I think there are important examples where there are differences between private and public assets. I like the way Paul phrased it. I'm working on a project now in Canada for First Nations communities, just as a context, as an example, where we have facilities up north to take care of children. We want to make these facilities better. These facilities, if we looked at fair market value or replacement value, I don't think they would actually capture the cost. These are, again, facilities to take care of kids that are dealing with difficult issues. I think operational value is the more appropriate concept. And this works as well for advanced countries. And I think over the next few years, you're going to see an expansion of infrastructure needs assessments, partly tied to sustainability issues. I think to have concepts like operational value makes a lot of sense. So I support the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That was very clear. Franz, Karen, and then Catherine.
Thank you, Thomas. I also agree that this is very valuable work to develop a public sector specific valuation principle as close as possible to the private sector principle. I think concepts just like highest and best use would not work well for the public sector. So I'm very much in favor of continuing the work on this, exploring it more, coming up with illustrative examples that are really appealing. And then after doing this exploratory work, there is still an option to look as to whether it would be a separate valuation principle or just some tweaking of the existing principles in IFRS 13.
Thank you, Franz. Karen, Catherine.
Thank you, Thomas. If I can ask a question first that perhaps someone from Secretariat can fill in later, but I'd be interested to know in terms of the equal share of responses for each of the three ways forward, whether there was a geographical divergence around that or whether it was even across the piece. But in common with others, I think you should try and use IFRS where it is relevant and appropriate to do that and not depart. So where assets are non-specialized assets, an asset that could be used in any sector, then I think we should be looking at IFRS 13. But where there are specialized assets, I think we do need to be looking at an alternative measurement base. I'm not convinced that replacement cost is that measurement base. I think in my experience, there are issues with doing that. So I think it's definitely worth looking at a measure that's specific for public sector. I would just add, and maybe hopefully I'm not stretching too far, but I think we do need in looking at a measurement base, be careful what we wish for. Because certainly in the UK, we have got lots of experience of difficulties in valuation that can bring in undue cost and complexity and lead to a whole bunch of issues. So I do think we need to have that needs to be borne in mind in developing proposals. Hopefully I didn't stretch that too far. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you, Karen. Catherine, last comment regarding the first question, and then we can move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably just echo Karen's comments and just to reiterate, we're getting quite a significant pushback from in the UK from some of the difficulties that arise from valuation and some of the costs that are involved in it, which anything that takes you off the beaten track of valuation is always going to be a difficulty. So I think whatever is done to develop this liaison with the valuation profession is really important because some of the modelling around the things that we do are just so complex. And I think the other issue that I think needs to be borne in mind and reiterated very carefully is cost benefit. Because if the costs of whatever method are instituted outweigh the benefits of delivery of information to users, then you're going to start hitting real problems, which is linked to the complexity point, obviously, and how easy or difficult it is to get the valuation. And there's the valuation part, there's the audit part of it as well. I think that are part of that. But I do reiterate that I'm not sure if I'm open-minded as to whether a completely separate standard is required or a completely different methodology. But what I would say is I agree with the others who've said wherever is possible, do what IFRS does, tweak it if necessary, and then only for those assets where it really doesn't work should a different methodology be used. But a completely new one, it does worry me in terms of adding more complexity rather than simplifying things, which I think would be really helpful.
Thanks, Catherine. I think that probably gives a good summary of kind of all the comments, indicating that yes, kind of the sector neutrality of concepts and principles should be in the focus, but wherever it's not possible, think about how to kind of find a deviation or a solution. I think split opinions regarding that requires a new measurement basis or whether some kind of tweaking of existing principles would be helpful already. And I think as Franz outlined, just try to find use cases, try to find examples, and then afterwards kind of kind of verify whether this is really a new measurement basis or whether this is applying existing principles in a slightly different way. So with that, Anwar, a last comment regarding that. First question, please, if we can be short here. Anwar, you're on mute.
I do support developing a public sector specific measurement basis, but they may entail a lot of complexities, which makes it a bit difficult to come out with a valuation model which may be globally applicable even for the entire public sector. You may think of heritage, such other items which really brings in factors in other than monetary values. So if we cannot really align ourselves fully in line with either IFRS 13 fair value, or for that matter with any particular specific basis as such. Ian will bear me out. In the UK, when the first issue of accounting for inflation came up, it started with current purchasing power theory. They shift on to replacement costing ED18 in the old days, and eventually they came out with fair value accounting, our current cost accounting in those days. But that has a lot of limitations. There are more limitations in the public sector. So to come out with one conceptual framework basis for valuation of all public sector entities is also a very complex exercise. So I think you may adopt one model, but leave enough flexibility to ensure variability of that model as and when necessary. It may be replacement costing, or it may be more likely alignment with IFRS 13, but then the scope should provide remodeling it to suit certain public sector entities as and when necessary. I think that's the only way out. Ian or Dave or Ross will know much better, of course. It cannot come out with it's extremely difficult, keeping in mind all the complexities involved, to come out one standardized valuation public sector model, although there is a need for it. Thank you.
Thanks, Anwar. I would ask Ian to come in before I hand over to Dave again to kind of give some information regarding the geographical divergence Karen asked for, and then reminding us of the second question we want to discuss. Ian.
So thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you very much, everyone, for the the points you've raised. I think this shows why, as Dave said, this is going to be a difficult area for us to redeliberate. I mean, I think first and foremost, actually, I would say I would probably go to the point that's been made about really needing to involve the valuation community in this, because I think there is a risk that we create something that's entirely a construct of the accounting profession that isn't actually related into the valuation techniques, measurement techniques, if you like, that are commonly understood. So I think that's one of the challenges. And really, we've had the discussion this morning has been around measurement bases, but importantly, underneath that is the concept about measurement techniques. And what IFRS 13 does is, when you're looking for a highest and best use, it gives you an approach to thinking about that. Move forward with something for the public sector that is trying to introduce a kind of way of thinking about things when you're looking at operational value, not highest and best use, because you're not actually able to, or you're not currently looking to dispose of that asset in the market. Then it's about how can we explain that better, and how can we articulate which techniques would be appropriate in supporting that. So I think we need to this is where we need to synthesize the comments, and it's going to take a while, but I think communication is going to be really important if we do move forward with this. And I think really tying it into the way in which the valuers would address this, and being clear about how they do it, and how that can work with the accounting concepts. That's really the challenge here. I think, certainly it's good to see that we have got support for the use of fair value. That certainly has been controversial in the past, but now that we have that embedded in our literature, in financial instruments, IPSAS 41, also in the leasing standard that we will be approving hopefully later on this week, I think it's really important that we do differentiate, if we need to, what the circumstances are, why that drives you to think a certain way, and how that would work out in practice through the techniques. And then we can loop back in a way and say, is that a separate basis? Because it's really about the techniques that's important, and that will definitely go to cost benefit.
Thanks, Ian, for that very helpful clarifications. Dave, bringing you in.
I just want to say, Karen, that's a great comment on looking at the geographical location of the respondents and see if there's kind of similarities by geography. You're one meeting ahead of us, Karen. We'll bring that back to the board in March. We'll also focus on, and I don't know whether this will be the case or not, but whether the audit group has a different perspective than the preparer group, and we'll break all that down. One comment I want to make on process, and we're taking a page out of what we did for revenue last year. The reason why we're not bringing that to the board in this meeting is we found it very useful in the revenue project, and hopefully with measurement as well. And it also ties into the CAG to really focus on what the high level issues are first and kind of wrap our minds around those, and then bring the kind of detailed analysis back later. And the reason I say it ties into the CAG is I think we'll have a very similar discussion with the board in a few days based on the same discussion we had today. And by focusing on the issues, we just think it moves the project along, I guess, more quickly or more smoothly. So in summary, Karen, you're one meeting ahead of us.
As always. Thank you. Dave, second question. Could you just remind us?
So the second question is, if you do agree with the public sector measurement basis, do you think that the IPSASB should continue exploring current operational value as that public sector measurement basis?
Thank you, Dave. I think some of you already started going in this direction. I think we heard from Janique some comments. Fabienne was going to go in this direction. Fabienne, do you want to come back, bringing in your points now?
Yes, thank you, Chair. It was just underlining the complexity of the current operational value as it is stated at the moment in the proposal. For instance, there is an assessment of the, if I understand correctly, the definition, there is an assessment of the level of achievement of an entity's service delivery objective, and it might be difficult to provide on a reliable basis. So that was an instance I was going to provide. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabienne. Further comments? I think I heard a lot of you supporting developing a public sector specific measurement basis. So I guess you have an opinion on how that should be done. Tim, and then Key.
Thanks. So I was listening to the answer to the first question, and I can add yes to that. But in terms of the second question, I mean, I think I was trying to think what being an economist, not an accountant, was thinking about what the problem one is trying to solve, and this is really that in the public sector it is challenging to put a value to the service, more challenging to put a value to the services that are being provided. And actually, if I think about it, the examples of health and education where you're actually providing a service to an individual pupil or a patient is actually probably easier to apply fair value than it is to things like public health, security and defense, and those types of services which are more of a public good. And really, the issue here is that it is almost a political judgment or the value to which one puts on these things. And so I think this is but I think still that it is important to do so, but to recognize when one is doing it in financial statements that one needs to be explicit and disclose what value one is providing, what one is actually providing to this to these services, and the implications of that on the financial statement. But I think that is the question, and I'm struggling with whether the term current operational value is the best term for it, but I think that's what one is effectively trying to do with this. And the thing is you can then go down a rabbit hole of prescribing lots of very, very technical ways of doing this, rather than actually keeping it very simple, but just saying that one has to do for these different services which are more of a public good, that one has to assign a value. And that is not a technical thing, that is actually a political thing.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Yeah, probably I think we have to be careful not to kind of mix that up with setting political priorities regarding services being priority compared to others. I think what we're trying to do here is first, but I think there is a clear kind of connectivity to what you just said, is to value the service potential embedded in an asset, not the service itself, but obviously via depreciation. I think that would put a value to the service provision as such as well. So I think it's a little bit complex indeed, as you phrased it correctly. Key, Catherine, and then Paul.
Thanks, Chair. For the first question, I do support that the IPSASB should adopt a public sector specific measurement basis. However, I think the definition as well as the established principles of current operational value is not perfect enough applying in practice of measuring the assets of public sector. The definition of current operational value may cause some problems. For example, in the vehicle case in ED 76 and ED 77, the current operational value of a vehicle is less for an entity that usually acquires a large number of vehicles in a single transaction and gets discounts than for an entity that purchases vehicles individually. This means that the same number of same type of vehicles of two entities with the same service capacity have different current operational value. The users of financial statements may rely on the current operational value of the vehicles to assess the service capacity. They will come to the conclusion that the entity of more power in price negotiation are of less service capacity. It may be misleading and the cross-entity comparability is impaired. So I think that maybe replacement cost could be the suitable measurement approach to support the concept of current operational value. Replacement cost now refers to to the cost required for the entity to replace the same asset at the report date. And the concept of current operational value, replacement cost should be the cost of acquiring asset with the same service potential at the reporting date. For example, the current operational value of an asset could be determined by the cost of replacing assets with the same or similar service potential, such as the same function, capacity, and the expected service life, and so on. In this way, different replacement costs reflect different service potentials. This improves the comparability of accounting information among different entities. Thank you.
Thanks, Key, for that. Catherine, then Paul, then Jeffrey.
I mean, I think measurement is such a huge issue in the public sector that I certainly think it's worth debating, what is the best answer for certain types of asset. But I come back to this point about which assets are you talking about, in terms of, because I would find it very difficult to justify applying a different measurement approach to all assets. I would restrict it to those that have specific public sector characteristics. And I also come back to the cost benefit argument, because if you are looking at both costs of application of a method, you also need to look at the benefits to the users, and what is it that, as Pim has pointed out, what is it the users of the financial statements really need to gain by way of good information from the asset values that you're looking at, and balancing those two criteria out mean that you are, by definition, looking at what users need specifically from the valuations that they're getting through the public sector financial statements. So I do think that's quite important, and I think you can apply that test across the different categories. So if you are looking at general office accommodation, for example, I think you'll find that the approach of just using normal fair value is probably much closer to what users want and give a reasonable cost benefit analysis. Whereas for some of the more specific assets that are only public sector or have specific public sector requirements, like network assets, like roads and rail, I think it's a different issue. Of course, there are private sector prisons, there are private sector hospitals. That I do think one ought to look at what those types of assets are. How those assets are looked at in the private sector, and what private sector users want from those, and whether it's a different in a public sector context, even if it's the same asset that a very similar asset that you're looking at. So I think I don't think one should make assumptions about the fact that some of these assets are purely public sector, because they won't be. And in fact, there'll be private sector roads as well. I don't know if there are any private sector railways, but there may well be, for all I know. So I do think that one ought to just always be looking at what the private sector is doing around these things. So I do think it's worth carrying on the debate. I am very nervous about the idea of yet another method of approximating some form of current value. But if the work is done that justifies that and it meets the cost benefit test, then I would be supportive of it.
Thanks, Catherine. I think, I probably agree that it's not necessarily the asset being public sector specific. It might be the context or the circumstances in which they are used or financed or whatever, which might be public sector specific. So that should be kind of reflected as well. Paul, Jeffrey, and then Gustavo.
Thank you. I just want to throw our hat into supporting the continuing work on current operational value. We see it as having more flexibility than replacement cost on its own would give. I kind of wonder, because my reading of this is that effectively replacement cost fair value are measurement techniques that you can use under this basis anyway. So for those assets where that would apply, that would seem to be the obvious measurement technique to use, and then the income technique or income approach for assets where that's relevant. So so I do wonder to some degree how much of the issues people are having with this is almost like too much choice, And I also wonder whether some of the question is actually whether an asset should be on current value or historical cost in the first place. And whether, I think in a previous response, we did question as to whether more guidance should be given about the choice of the two overarching sort of approaches or basis in the first place, rather than sort of concentrate the problem further on down the measurement chain. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Jeffrey, Gustavo, and then Kevin.
Thank you, Thomas, and apologies again for having disappeared and for perhaps saying things that have already been said while I was away. I've got a few points on this, actually. I think somewhere it says that this is a sort of a evaluation hierarchy, but I don't see that. I think these are different ways of valuing, actually, and perhaps that was something I picked up that shouldn't be there, but I'm not sure here we're talking about a hierarchy. We're talking about different possibilities or different methods, and what's not clear to me is when you should use which method, actually. So that's one point. It's probably a very minor point, actually. A second point is that when I was reading through all this, I found it quite confusing when there was to cover both assets and liabilities, almost at the same level and using the same techniques. And it was sort of, in many ways difficult, but not impossible to understand when it came to the assets, the valuation of assets. But for the liabilities, I found it much less intuitive. And I'm wondering if part of the complication and the confusion may come from that. And, should perhaps the liabilities somehow be separated out and approached slightly differently. A current operational value of a liability is a bit of a difficult concept to get, well, at least get my head around. Perhaps others find it easier. I think a third point I have is it's a little bit unclear to me what this is all meant to achieve. And this is perhaps my weakness, but is this about the balance sheet and having some sort of valid validation on the balance sheet, or is it, and this is mentioned, throughout some of these documents, about somehow calculating the cost of service? And do you do this valuation in order to measure cost of service? Because if it's about cost of service, then you need to consider very carefully the income and expenditure side of things, because somehow the balance sheet is a little bit difficult to make that connection, and particularly if you're going to be making changes in valuations, and how that then gets reflected against cost of service. I found that a little bit difficult to somehow follow. And I think this brings me to my main point, that the whole concept would, and I think probably this was mentioned when I was away, would benefit from some very good examples, actually, just to make it very clear what are we talking about here, and where would this be important, and what would it look like? There is an example there that she pulled up, which is this thing about vehicles, the current operational value of vehicles, and to take into account that you may have, if you're buying a lot of vehicles, then you get a lower price. But that doesn't seem to me at all to do with the operational value of a vehicle. That's entirely to do with the sort of replacement cost. So as an example, it doesn't really work, I think, for me at least, for this current operational value. But I think, that it would benefit from some good examples, and that might actually help to perhaps simplify it and give a better idea of what it's all about and why. Thank you. And sorry for the length of my intervention.
Thanks, Jeffrey. No, it's all fine. And actually, I think Franz already brought up this point as well, to kind of try to develop well-speaking examples, and then to look back from that whether something completely new is needed, or whether some tweaking of existing principles are doing the job. So Agnieszka, then Kevin, and then Gustavo.
Thank you, Thomas. Let me refer once again to the public sector specificity, and I will build on the Catherine comment, because I also wanted to refer to the hospital example, and I agree that there are no public sector specific assets. There may be public sector specific context, as you say, Thomas, but sometimes it's not even that. It seems that it's public sector specific context, but it's not. We will be, a few people today raised highest and best use concept as being the bone of contention of all this discussion, why we shouldn't be applying fair value. And I assume that behind that thinking is that in the private sector, an entity would apply highest and best use concept to its assets. So for example, let's imagine that the private sector entity has a building in which it runs a hospital. This is private based, so it's profit-making business, and it seems that it would be much better to have a hotel there. But if I can refer now to the issue that we've already discussed today, I mean sustainability issue. A lot more private entities have right now corporate social responsibility strategy, and it's not only profit making, but it's also in the strategy of that entity to supply alternative medical services in the city center. That's why this private entity, because of this concept of highest and best use, would not get rid of the hospital in the city center in this building, and would not, change the business model just to run a hotel there, because the highest and best use of this building would be to run a hotel there. So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes there is no even this context of the public sector. Sometimes it's some kind of stereotype as we think about doing business, the private sector business. So sometimes maybe the private sector accounting should go into the direction of the public sector accounting. Maybe private sector accounting also should assume that there is operational value in the assets of the company, because not just profit making is the aim of the company, but having in mind that more and more have CSR strategies and have different aims, not just profit making and maximizing the profit for investors. And in that context, maybe it's not just different in the public sector. Sorry for making things more complicated instead of giving advice in which direction you should go, but I couldn't resist to share that thought with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Agnieszka, and we are very thankful that you shared that thought, because I think it's actually very interesting to say it's not only that we always think that private sector concepts are not used or not usable for the public sector. Sometimes they are not even used in the private sector. So I fully understand what you're talking about, and I think that's a very interesting point to take forward. Kevin, Gustavo, and then Isabel, and then I think we move on to the third question, which is quite a short question, but nevertheless, I want to touch on it. Kevin.
Thank you, Chair. So there's a quote from Abraham Lincoln that says that first we need to decide on what needs to be done, and then we'll figure out how to do it. So, I think we haven't necessarily resolved whether or not there is a strong need to have a separate calculation or for operational value. And I think valuation is complicated, but I think again there is an example in Canada. I think there are examples. While most assets probably there's some you can find good benchmarks with the private sector. They could be used. They're interchangeable, including even hospitals. I think in the provision of some social services. Again, one of the #1 issues in Canada is dealing with First Nations people. We provide social services to children far up north, and we can, again, we have buildings there that are not adequate to provide these services. We can draw comparisons. We can calculate operational values of what services are provided for non-Indigenous children in big, urban centers. We can compare, those operational values. As Francis, we can calculate benchmarks. And so I think there are examples. It may be limited. And I think to quote somebody else, Kierkegaard talked about the dizziness of freedom. I think it is not a bad thing to have choice. In some cases, when we are dealing with assets that are very, very different than private sector assets in the public sector, to have an operational value concept, I think could be quite useful. And there's work that could be done on valuation, even though it is complicated.
Thank you, Kevin. Gustavo, and then Isabel.
Thank you. I'm a little concerned that current operational value is very similar to value in use for non-cash generating assets. So that could be difficult for users to understand why we have two concepts really similar, but in different contexts and with different objectives. I think that we should simplify that. Maybe if IPSAS 21 we release a new version, replace value in use for this new concept, or maybe this concept try to approach to value in use. Because I was reading the proposal and I was thinking this is really similar to value in use. Why we didn't use that concept that we already have? Thank you.
Thanks, Gustavo. Last comment, Isabel, and then hand it over back to Dave.
Thank you very much. I think I can keep it very short because some of you have already stated the same position as I have. I'm on the opinion that we should not continue developing the current operating value. Personally, I think that it is always difficult to introduce new valuation concepts or new terminologies like such a term like current operational value. I think it will be very difficult and it would take a long time to establish this concept. So, and therefore, I think and I truly believe that it is possible that we should rather use the existing terminologies, in particular the fair value concept, that we can enhance with good public sector specific examples. And with these examples, it will be possible to address all public sector issues. I'm absolutely convinced of this. So, so that's my point of view on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabel. Dave, back to you. Kind of introducing quickly the third question.
So I won't spend a lot of time on background. I'll just quickly point people to the paper. And there might not be a lot of feedback on this, but I just wanted to highlight that when we review responses, we really consider three factors. Is there any information in the response to the IPSASB has not previously considered? Does it raise an issue specific to the public sector? Or does it identify an issue with this specifically with the principal? And just because, and maybe I'll be wrong on this, but I foresee us spending a lot of time on current operational value in 2022. And I thought it was useful to ask CAG members whether there's anything else you can think of that we should consider specifically as it relates to current operational value.
So open up the floor for last comments regarding this third question, the analysis approach of the responses and the focus. Isabel, having been last time, being first now.
I do not have a comment which is precisely on these three factors, but nevertheless, I would like to tell you what I thought when I read the paper. So I think in case you consider not continuing developing the current operational value, you may be concerned about the fact that, of course, some people are very much in favor of the current operational value. So I would look at the comments of those who are in favor of the current operational value and check what is the particular issue that they value and what they appreciate. You may take some important information on how to shape the fair value concept in a way that you can still make these people happy. I don't know if you understood what I mean.
100%.
Yeah,
making people happy is a global concept.
Yes,
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Paul, and then Karen.
Thank you. I'm not sure I can really add too much in respect to the current discussion, apart from one question was raised amongst our members as to whether the IPSASB could also, or staff could also consider the characteristics of a responder, i.e. is the response from a rare, sort of the rare commentary from a specialist in the field, representative of an association, regional association, that sort of aspect as maybe another criteria. Now, again, I understand that these particular criteria aren't necessarily public. We perhaps would support making them public as part of the transparency of a decision-making process. But some other questions arose from these criteria, as you would probably expect. So concerns amongst our stakeholders were raised that there was perhaps a weighting between each of the criteria. I mean, it's not specifically stated in the CAG documents, but whether one of those criteria would be considered more important than the other. And there was also maybe a concern that perhaps bias would be given to people that perhaps didn't agree with the proposal because they provided additional information rather than actually the support of people who just agreed with the proposal but didn't provide any new or novel information or things that the board hadn't previously considered. And there was also in the identified principle related challenges section, there was a comment of higher quality responses, and this did raise questions as to whether there were further hidden criteria that were considered when considering responses, or it might just be a question of the wording in the actual CAG documents. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Karen, and then I would ask Ross to come in for some closing remarks regarding this topic.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I'll be trying to be brief on this. I think a lot of this has been covered in the discussion, but I would come back to the sort of three key things really. Do we need to do anything different from a kind of sector neutrality point of view? And then the other two really are about the preparer's perspective in terms of the complexity of what's there and obtaining the information that's needed, and going to that sort of cost benefit point that was raised. And then linked to that is the user perspective in terms of what is the user going to gain out of any developments that are made. So being really practical and thinking about actually what does this mean for preparers of information, and then saying, well, actually, are the users of information going to gain anything out of the changes? And I think those are really important lenses to be looking at all of this through. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Ross, some closing remarks regarding this topic. Dave, if you want.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I just wanted to react a little bit and add a little bit of clarity on our process, just so everyone's aware, based on maybe a couple of Paul's comments more principally. But one of the key factors related to all of our consultations is they're freely open for anyone who wants to put their comments in. We post those publicly on the website so everybody can see what's in the comments and make their own analysis if they don't agree with ours. Plus, all of our board papers for the CAG and the board itself are publicly posted on the website and available to be seen, and we leave those up indefinitely. We don't take down our board papers. So the board's discussions also happen in an open manner. So I think to the point of your internal discussion, whether we're weighting factors differently or not, I think you can always judge that by watching the discussions or looking at the papers, because we don't do that in secret. And I think that's probably one of the most important parts of how we analyze all of our responses, is that we do it open in the public. The comments are always publicly open, and we don't restrict who can give us comments. And I think that's the base factor that we follow in everything we do. To some of your points, there's some validity to that. I would say that, negative points that disagree with what we say tend to get a little bit more discussion, because we feel we have to build consensus and move the project forward. And it's usually not the ones that say, yeah, okay, we agree, that cause us the trouble. It's how are we going to deal with the ones that have issues? And that's where these factors come into play. So is it a problem of principle? Is it a problem of the concept itself? Has the board not discussed this? So that's kind of where the principles Dave highlighted come in, because we don't want to redeliberate the same points over and over again because someone has a strong view and keeps making that view. So I think it's more of an art than a science. I can tell you we don't apply factors and decide whether one factor is more important. And I think the other point I wanted to touch on that you touched on was the quality point. When we talk about quality of response, it's usually when people give us support for why they think one way or another that we would consider it higher quality, not that we agree with their point better than another point. So often we'll get someone who says they agree, but they don't tell us why, or they disagree and they also don't tell us why. So a quality response gives us the richness to understand why they agree or disagree and what they think would be a better solution. So that's a high quality response versus a low quality response. With that, just not much more to say on this. Thomas, I did want to just thank all of the CAG members. Yesterday was International Volunteers Day, and I think this has been another great CAG meeting. I know we're coming to a sum, but I did want to take the opportunity to thank everyone who's been contributing to the CAB's work. You're all volunteers. We wouldn't be able to do this without you, and just, you know, heartfelt thanks from the IPSASB, the staff, and the organization IFAC. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ross, for appreciating that. Today was CAG Volunteers Day, so thank you to all the CAG members for their great input. Dave, anything you want to kind of mention as a last comment regarding this agenda topic?
Just because it's fresh in my mind, one of the messages I just kind of heard come through clear, whether you agree or disagree, was just don't overcomplicate this and really think through what the users need. And that's that perspective, kind of stepping back, because I'm really in the weeds and the IPSASB gets into the weeds on this, is very helpful. So to echo Ross's comment is just a big thank you from me. This really does help us in our process.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I'm switching over to my iPhone again because the connection broke down again. So thanks for that summary. I think the other point I just kind of catched and was sticking to my mind was start with use cases, try to figure examples, and then think backwards. I think that was also a very useful comment. So with that, I think we can close the official part of the meeting. I just want to thank everybody for the contributions. Allow a few minutes of stopping the live stream, and please, members, stay on board with us so that we can have a few minutes